Welcome to Prescription for Justice. My name is Martin Donahue. The fact that lead is a significant environmental toxin with serious health effects was known for many years, yet hidden from the general public by an industry concerned more about profit than about public health. The health and economic consequences of lead poisoning persist today, costing the U.S. billions and the world $1 trillion each year. If not for the work of historians, scientists, and activists, things would be much worse. My guest for this episode and the next is one of those historians, David Rosner. He and I will discuss past and present sources of lead exposure, the health effects of acute and chronic lead poisoning, and how an industry has caused a decades-long public health tragedy that is ongoing today, along with what we can do about it. David Rosner, PhD, MPH, focuses on research at the intersection of public health and social history and the politics of occupational disease and industrial pollution. He is currently the Ronald H. Lauterstein Professor of Sociomedical Sciences and co-director of the Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health and a member of the National Academy of Sciences National Academy of Medicine. Professor Rosner is an author of many books on occupational disease, epidemics, and public health, including Deceit and Denial, The Deadly Politics of Industrial Pollution and Lead Wars, The Politics of Science and the Fate of America's Children, both with Gerald Markowitz. Dr. Rosner, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I want to get into your background and how Deceit and Denial came about, but first I think it's worth it to our viewers to talk about briefly some of the health and environmental and economic consequences, and we can delve into those a little deeper later. But to set the stage, why is lead dangerous?
Lead has been known to be one of the most deadly and destructive industrial toxins for literally centuries. You've heard stories about the Romans who had lead pipes that fed their water system. Some people claimed it's been the destruction of the Roman Empire because people were lead poisoned back then. During the Middle Ages and the early 19th century, you had vast numbers of workers who became poisoned because they were either working in mines with lead or alternatively they were working in different factories that were producing different products that were used, that lead was used in. Paint has historically been one of the worst public uses of this material. The problem with lead is that it causes tremendous damage both to the physiology of the human being as they grow older, but more specifically to the neurology of all of us. When you ingest lead in any quantities, it is dangerous. In the old days, before 1920, 19-teens, the major problem that affected workers who were being exposed to lead was the fact that they went into convulsions, seizures, and death. They literally were killed by exposure to amounts of lead that they were experiencing in factories. At the same point in time, children began to die of lead poisoning, also going into seizures and going into comas. So lead is a major problem for all parts of the human body, the kidneys, the heart, etc. But it's a special problem for the neurology of all of us.
Mm-hmm. And prior to the architectural era, lead, like other heavy metals, I assume was just in the soil. How is it that it came to be discovered and, say, the Romans decided, let's use this in pipes?
Well, there are a number of things. Lead is very easily mined. One of the problems is it's often very close to the surface, and you can come across it. It's also a very valuable metal. You can bend it. If anybody's ever played the old game of Clue, you'll remember, Mrs. Peabody being killed by the lead pipe in the dining room. You used to have that little piece of lead that you could bend in half. So it's a very malleable metal. It can be shaped very easily. So it can be used in all sorts of objects where you want to bend. Plumbing, for example, water pipes, where you're trying to fit fixtures together and you don't have really skill to make sure you can use copper, which will crack. You can bend lead a little bit. It also has a taste. It's also a little sweet, so people tended to put it as a sweetener in wines at times. There's all sorts of reasons why this material became really widely used. It melts at a low temperature, so you can use it as solder. You can mold it. It's pliable that way. So it has lots of uses. In the 19th and earlier centuries, it had lots of very practical uses. It wasn't widely used because we didn't have big industrial centers. I mean, it wasn't like we had giant factories for most of the American and world history. It's really the beginning of the 1900s, 19th century going forward that you start seeing the creation of large factories where lead becomes really useful in a number of ways. And so by the 19th century, we had an industry that produced lead. Miners produced lead, but it wasn't widely distributed. It's only really in the late 19th and 20th centuries that we saw lead becoming ubiquitous all around us, and therefore not only a problem for workers in the plant, but a problem for all of us living in an environment that was literally at times covered with lead.
So there are a few places that lead was used in the 20th century, and I'd like to delve into the rationale for this. So one of the places where lead was used, and in fact is still found in 6 countries on the planet, is gasoline. Why put lead in gasoline?
That was one of the first controversies that developed about lead in the 1920s. Lead was found to boost the octane of gasoline. For those of you who are delving into history a little bit, up until the 1920s, the major car producer in the world, in the country, was the Ford Motor Company, who produced this little car that went puttering around the world at 40 miles an hour called the Model T. It was formed in 1908, continued until 1928, and it literally had the same shape, the same color. The color was black, same contours every year from 1908 until it finally went out of production. In early 1920s, General Motors Corporation discovered this fantastic fact that they were about to go broke. They were really a second-rate company. But they discovered that if they introduced this stuff called tetraethyl lead into gasoline, it did a couple of things. It, one, stopped the knock that cars used to have. You may be old enough, I can certainly remember cars going puttering around. All those little knocks in the engine were lost energy because the gasoline was burning unevenly. Adding this little stuff called tetraethyl lead to it reduced the knock. It made the gasoline burn evenly and also burn consistently, and you weren't losing energy every time you heard that little knock. So what it did is increase the power of gasoline, the power of car engines tremendously. General Motors became known as the producers of Cadillacs, of Buicks, of Chevrolets, all of which depended upon this big fat engine that could create a lot of energy. It could go much faster and it could go longer distances with this stuff added to it. So General Motors, along with DuPont, which had actually produced the first parts of the first chemical tetraethyl lead, General Motors introduced it into their car engines through the Standard Oil Company. 3 of the biggest corporations in the world got together to basically produce it, invent it, and use it. And they became the center of the tetraethyl lead in the big, what become the gas-guzzling muscle cars of the 1940s and 1950s.
And we'll come back to that in a moment, because much of tonight's story is what did these companies know and when. Let's move on to the second product, though, paint. Why was lead ever placed into paint?
Lead is a product that has so many bizarre little uses. One of the products that they discovered in the really 1700s was that if lead happened to be hanging around in horse manure, I mean, ironically enough, in manure, it caused a chemical reaction that changed pure lead shavings into what's called lead carbonate, a very pure white material. It was a material that was considered this ideal medium for the use in lead paint, right? That was go to cover barns and other farm products, farm institutions, agrarian country. But in the late 19th century and early 20th century, as the cities grew, it also began to be used on the walls of houses. The reason it was so profitable was, again, as I mentioned, it was pretty easily mined for the most part. But it was also, it was mined by giant companies that began to have a real stake in selling it. And one of the problems with lead is that it always seems to return in many objects. In other words, you can always find recyclable ways of using it. When you think of a car battery, you have lead in your car battery. That lead in that car battery could be recycled. It could be reused. If you have lead on shields for radiation, for example, you can, again, those radiation shields don't wear out. They're there forever. But the problem with lead and mining is that if you have a mine, that mine has to keep producing lead forever. Unless you can constantly use it, lead mines either collapse internally, or they get wet, or they become unusable. Mining communities are often in rural areas. And if you stop using those mines, the population that mined that lead will vanish. And you can't basically react to markets very easily. You can't open a mine quickly when there's a war and you need bullets, right? Lead bullets. You can't open a mine quickly when suddenly the economy booms and you need batteries. You have to have these mines constantly producing this stuff. The one thing nice about paint is that you always, once you get rid of that lead, you never see it again. That's what they said. It's great because it vanishes. It goes on the walls. It's never going to come back in any kind of reused form. It's not recyclable. So lead paint became a means by which these mining companies had an opportunity to produce a product that would allow their mines to continue to operate. So Sherwin-Williams had mines, National Lead had mines, and what they did is they established brands of paint that they could market that would basically be a constant outlet for their product, as they said. It's an outlet for a product, it's not going to come back. So there's a real economic incentive in finding a way of wasting lead by putting it on the walls of our nation.
And today, where do we find lead?
All around us, unfortunately. As one of my researchers said in 1920, he said, we live in a lead world. A child lives in a lead world. The walls of our older houses are covered with it in different layers. Every year, every 5 years or so, when you painted your house, you would have another layer of lead put on it. It's in the pipes, of course, in Flint and Newark and other cities throughout the country. It's in our pipes. It was in our gasoline from 1920s when we introduced to the 1990s when we finally banned it after realizing it was in the air we breathe. It was in the soil. It was surrounding us, and that's the problem we face. We have this major neurological toxin that's sitting there, that's always available in different forms to kids who play in their yards, to kids who drink the water, kids who live in older houses that are slightly crumbling and which lead ends up on the floors. It's everywhere, and the problem is what to do about it.
And to talk about how recent some of these phase-outs were, for instance, lead was phased out of paints in 1978, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the United States, and out of gasoline, it was, I believe, in the mid-90s. And as I said, there's still 6 places on the planet where it's still used, and then out of pipes in the mid-80s.
Well, it wasn't phased out. I mean, the pipes are still there.
Right. It wasn't put into new pipes. But today, you can find it in bullets. In fact, California banned lead bullets a few years back, and the Obama administration banned the use of lead bullets on federal lands, a ban that was overturned by Trump. And interestingly, there's about 83,000 tons of lead bullets that go into the environment every year, putting people at shooting ranges at risk, those who eat meat with buckshots of lead in them, and even the Army has started to move towards copper bullets. So the Army's getting it faster than the environmental side of things. But medicines, fruit juices, plumbing, other places?
Sure. Well, toys, candies, even. Sometimes we find it in candies that are imported sometimes.
So how does it get there? How does it get into the toys and the candies?
That's really a question we don't really have much information about because many of the toys, at least the older toys, were painted with lead. And there were bans on lead.
Sure.
Leaded. But the newer toys supposedly didn't have it. But lead sometimes appears in plastics, right? It can be used as a plasticizer, so it ends up being used in different kinds of
malleability.
For some reason, I don't really understand. It's in ceramics that are imported. It's also in our beautiful crystal vases. A very interesting story happened at Columbia University where I work, where one of our researchers was in an elevator talking about lead, and he mentioned that sometimes used it gives a lovely little, kind of bluish tint to your crystal. And another professor said, I have lots of crystal in my house. I don't, as lead, I have all my drink in it. And he said, well, bring it in. And the guy started bringing in his crystal decanters with his alcohol in it. And they did a test. And the stuff was basically this toxic brew because it had leached all the lead out of the crystal.
Right.
It just sits there. So it's all around, and it appears in the weirdest places at the weirdest times.
Right. We also see exposure among those who are mining gold, particularly in developing nations where lead is used to help remove the gold amalgam or to separate it into pure gold away from the amalgam. Tell me about how you got your start in occupational health history, which is a fascinating story, and Deceit and Denial.
Okay. It's a very, serendipitous story, but I'll try not to go too deep in my personal history, but I was, believe it or not, an undergraduate in psychology at college. And I was trying to decide what kind of graduate school I would go to. Freudian or Jungian psychology was the most useful thing for kids. While there, it was a psychiatric unit out on Long Island, which was with very poor kids who had been shipped there after getting in trouble in school, having hallucinations, all sorts of things. And when I got there and was doing all my little psychological tests with the kids, I realized the kids really had terrible neurological problems. They could not follow a line when they were drawing. They couldn't do the most basic kind of trace that you had with this, what was called the Bender Gestalt test. They couldn't do the most basic things that kids could do. They were lovely kids, but they were there they had real perceptual problems. And so I started looking in their records, and I realized a lot of these kids were not troubled by bad mothering. These kids had real physiological problems due to the ingestion, a lot of them of lead. So I got interested, and it was always in the back of my mind that I wasn't really interested in psychology so much, but especially during the 60s, I was interested in preventing this and preventing lead poisoning and preventing damage to these kids in different ways, not necessarily only lead. So I ended up going to public health school, getting a master's in public health, thinking I was going to stop and prevent disease. And I was a kid, right? I was very optimistic, very idealistic, and this was going to be my life's calling. And I went back and worked with a mental health department and realized I had no interest in preventing disease. They weren't interested in really going out and reforming the environment in which these kids lived. They were housing kids. And I got very frustrated with it and went back, and the only way I could figure out why I was so frustrated in my professional life was to understand the history of it. And I ended up going back and getting a PhD at Harvard in the history of science. I said, I'm going to learn this history, learn about why we are so stuck with trying to cure disease when the problems that are affecting us are so clearly due to the environments in which we live. So that was kind of the incipient moment. My first dissertation was really on hospitals and healthcare and the problems of healthcare. But I had one line in there that I snuck into my first book that always bothered me. It was a line about who was ending up in the 19th century hospitals that I was writing about. And it wasn't kids, the hospitals weren't organized around diseases like we think about them today. They were often organized around accidents, injuries, disasters at work. people who were being harmed by the worlds they were building, people who were coming in through ambulances, the first ambulances. And these hospitals were being built around a world we were creating. And that became really interesting to me. And my first books were really about occupational environmental health. And that's what I've been writing since the 1980s with Jerry. Because I'm a social historian and a political historian about the kind of political and social history of disease and occupational disease specifically. So now we've written, 7 or 8 books together on different aspects of environmental.
And so the first book, Deceit and Denial, was about vinyl chloride, polyvinyl chloride. And I know you came about the documents in a rather unusual way.
It was on vinyl. The first half of it was about lead. It was a book that was trying to...
The first one I'm aware of, being a little younger.
Yeah, it was about trying to capture the history of the 20th century by looking at substances. Lead for the first half of the 20th century, and vinyl chloride, the new plastics industry, the new kind of industrial poisons that we're polluting ourselves with in the second half. Right. So that was the idea of the book, these 2 parts.
And many of the same players in the vinyl chloride industry. But tell us how you came about finding the documents implicating industry.
Yeah. We came across this lawyer in a town called Lake Charles, Louisiana, right up the Mississippi River in the bayou area, and who we had heard through another lawyer had huge amounts of materials about this toxic material called vinyl chloride and what was happening in the chemical industry. We called him on a whim and thought we would go down there just to see what he really had, thinking he'd have a couple of file draws. What we came across when we went down there was this extraordinary lawyer who had been consumed, obsessed with a couple of clients of his who had been poisoned in Lake Charles by the chemical industry, an industry that was producing this stuff called vinyl chloride. And he had collected not just a couple of draws of information, but he had collected over a number of years, literally a house full of documents. He had been a member of a firm, his father's firm, and his father got so frustrated with him because he was so obsessed with these 2 cases and was gathering so much information that he basically asked him, and he was not earning any money for the firm, asked him to basically move out and take this duplex apartment and just move away from the firm because he was a bad influence, I think, on other lawyers who saw the son of the owner basically sitting with this obsessive nature on this one issue.
Right.
We went over there, so it was a house filled from top to bottom, the sink, the kitchen cabinets, everything, file drawers and boxes, all with material from the chemical industry that was producing the stuff that he had gotten through the process of discovery. Legal.
And so you wrote this book. Subsequently, that and your writings about lead, well, that book got you in quite a bit of trouble with industry. They even had a hired gun historian who tried to discredit your work. It led to some subpoenas, some testimony. One of the ways that industry tries to prevent knowledge about public health getting out is harassment, and it often works because it diverts academics' time, their financial resources, and frankly scares them, and especially younger investigators who might say, this is not worth the hassle, I don't have the backing maybe that someone as powerful as David Rosner might have through his publisher and through the university, and the whole tactic is designed to scare people away from investigating the background of these environmental disasters that, as you say, are so important to the public's health. Why don't we come back to the auto industry, and then we'll pick up with the paint industry next time. When did the auto industry know that there was something wrong with the lead in the gasoline that could have public health consequences? Or does it really go before the auto industry that people knew even before the development of cars that something's wrong with lead?
Well, the general public understood that lead was an industrial toxin, but they had no idea about it being an environmental toxin.
Okay.
They didn't understand that. But in the early 20s, General Motors and the Standard Oil Company, actually, that was producing the lead, found that their workers were going into hallucinations and seizures. And unfortunately for General Motors and for Standard Oil, workers who were getting poisoned in the plant they were developing it in Bayway, New Jersey, just south of New York, began to be pulled by ambulance from their plant to New York hospitals, where these people were identified as suffering from something called loony gas. They started talking about how they were acting loony. It was the moon. The moon was causing some kind of terrible seizures because so many workers in that factory in Bayway, New Jersey, that was producing tetraethyl lead were constantly swiping at the air because they thought they saw things fluttering by and walking by. That was one of the common symptoms. The bad symptoms were the ones who ended up in the hospital, who actually were hallucinating and ultimately dying. So there were five people who died in 1923 in the House of Butterflies, and who were major headlines throughout the country about what was causing these people to develop this terrible loony gas disease. Discovered tetraethyl lead. And that was, so they knew from very early on. They knew before that, but this was what became a public issue in 1923.
Well, we're going to return to that in our next episodes. This is a fascinating story, and we're going to continue in part 2 with Dr. David Rosner. My name is Martin Donahoe. Please join us. You'll be able to watch both episodes back-to-back online on our YouTube channel. So if you're watching this on television now, you don't have to wait a month. You can go straight to the website, Prescription for Justice on YouTube, and watch both episodes. My name is Martin Donahoe. We will return just after this.